So welcome to topic 4 of ethical hacking, and this topic is about legislation and also about cybercrime. So we have here a little bit of discussion about contemporary cybercrime. So when we talk about contemporary, we just mean something that's a little bit more up to date. So due to developments in technology and the ubiquitous nature of the internet, cybercrime has been evolving over the years and continues to evolve. And there were some primitive hackers in the 1960s and 1970s that did some hacking with the phone system, the telephone systems. But some of these basic principles that were applied in the early days of hacking still apply today. The internet has made hacker tools much further reaching than before. So cyber attacks can affect a huge number of systems in a very short space of time. So in line with this, approaches to tackling cybercrime have also changed. Okay, so as we go through the next section of the notes, legislation has also evolved in order to criminalize certain actions that were previously not considered to constitute a crime. So one of the main issues in tackling cybercrime in the modern era is the apparent disconnect between technology and legislation. So technology is changing rapidly. New tools and techniques are available all the time, and legislation is also updating, probably by no means as rapidly as technology. So there's an exercise that we can look at in more detail when we get to the end of this topic. So legislation, to legislate is to do with legal process, and legislation consists of law passed by the government or the act or process of making laws. So legislation is law that has been produced by a governing body in order to regulate, authorize, sanction, grant, declare, or restrict. So not something that I'm a specialist in by any means, legislation, more something for a lawyer to talk about than me, but we can talk about how it relates to ethical hacking in particular. So legislation is one of the most important instruments of government in organizing society and protecting citizens, or perhaps you could think of it as not protecting citizens. Now, legislation determines, amongst other things, the rights and responsibilities of individuals and authorities to whom the legislation applies. Now, in the UK, we have an Act of Parliament. And an Act of Parliament is a law that has been approved by the British Parliament. And Britain has a second type of law that's not being passed through Parliament that's called common law. Okay, now an act starts as a draft called a bill, which is debated in the House of Commons, and if that bill is then approved, the bill is passed to a specialist committee for revision. Their changes are discussed, revised, and then there can be many changes and the bill will be passed back and forward. And this means it can be quite a lengthy process to go through. So after a formal vote on a law, the bill then passes from the House of Commons, which are elected officials, to the House of Lords, which is the second chamber in the UK. Now, the House of Lords can then debate the bill and can potentially return it to the House of Commons. And the House of Lords can actually reject something twice before the Commons can, in some sense, overrule them. So the Lords will vote on a bill before returning it to the Commons, and some acts will take immediate effect. And the final stage, after the House of Lords has agreed on the legislation, is that the law itself will be signed by the Queen and is given royal assent. And once it has been signed by the Queen and given royal assent, it then becomes an act. So some acts will immediately take place, but other acts might take a while to bring in because of various problems with bringing them in. And so a bill doesn't become a law until it becomes an act. Then it becomes legal. So here's some modern legislation and some examples of some legislation here. And this unit will cover some different ones. And I've split this topic across 2 weeks. So this week we're mainly looking at data protection. So we have the Data Protection Act 2018. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, okay, is an EU piece of legislation, and that was brought into law in the UK by the Data Protection Act 2018. Okay, then there's the Computer Misuse Act 1990. Then we have this one. This one gets shortened to REPA, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. Then we have the Investigatory Powers Act 2016, which is sometimes called the Snoopers Charter, allows the government to spy on your internet history. Then there's the Police and Justice Act, which is to do, as you might guess, with the police. Then there is the Copyright Designs and Patents Act, which is to do with copyright designs and patents. And then we have an Intellectual Property Act as well. So a little bit of history here. Up until very recently, we had the Data Protection Act 1998. The Data Protection Act 1998 was the law in the UK for 18 years, and it was designed to protect personal data, and it was very useful in the earlier part of this century. It was a real update on the legislation. And there's a little summary of this act before we look at the Data Protection Act 2018, which replaced this act here. It superseded the... So, with more and more organisations using computers to store and process personal information, there was a danger that information could be misused or get into the wrong hands. So a number of concerns arose. Who could access this information? How accurate was the information? Could it be copied? Was it possible to store information about a person without the individual's knowledge or permission? And was a record kept of any changes made to the information? So the purpose of the Data Protection Act 1998 was passed by Parliament to control the way that information was handled. And other European Union countries have passed similar laws, as often information can be held in more than one country. For example, quite often companies will prefer to keep their servers in the Republic of Ireland as opposed to keeping them in the UK, because the Republic of Ireland has much lower corporation tax. So it's cheaper to keep information in the Republic of Ireland. You pay less tax there. Now, the Data Protection Act was developed to lay down rules about how data could be used. And the 1998 Act covered information or data stored on a computer or in an organised paper filing system. And the Data Protection Act was about living people. Okay, so there were rules that people had to follow, and there was an information commissioner to enforce those rules. But it didn't stop companies storing information about people. It just got them to follow the rules. And it defined two types of personal data, and we still have this. So personal data would be things like your name and your address, okay? Sensitive personal data would be things like if you've got a criminal record, your religion, any political opinions you have, this is considered to be sensitive personal data. So those are the two different types of data. Now, there are fewer and fewer safeguards for personal data than there are for sensitive personal data. So sensitive personal data is more closely guarded than personal data. And in most cases, a person must be asked specifically if sensitive data can be held about them. So there were three roles. We had an information commissioner who had the powers to enforce this Data Protection Act. A data controller was the person or company that collected the data, and a data subject was the subject of the data, what the data was about. So this was all in place for the previous 20 years until recently, when the Data Protection Act 2018 was brought into law. Now, a lot of people mistakenly call the Data Protection Act 2018 the General Data Protection Regulation. Not mistakenly, the names are used somewhat interchangeably. Now, the General Data Protection Regulation here is actually a regulation brought in by the EU. Okay, so this was a piece of regulation, an advisory regulation created by the EU. Now, there is a misconception, a misunderstanding that the EU make laws. Okay, the EU doesn't make laws. The EU creates regulations, and the member countries of the EU are responsible for bringing in their own law to come up to standard with this regulation. So we have the Data Protection Act 2018. France will have a similar Data Protection Act, and France's Data Protection Act will bring into law the regulations in the GDPR. Okay, so Spain will have a similar one, Italy will have a similar one, and so it's a misconception to say that the GDPR is the law, although the names are sometimes used interchangeably. In the UK, the law is called the Data Protection Act 2018. Okay, now the UK, since this law came in 2018, the UK has now left the EU, but we still have this law in place, so we're still in compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU, despite not being a member of the EU. And when this General Data Protection Regulation was released by the EU, there was other countries around the world, countries in South America, countries in Asia, brought in their own data protection acts based on this General Data Protection Regulation. One of the issues with the Data Protection Regulation is that there are some quite strict laws on storing data outside of the EU or outside of an area that's covered by the GDPR. So, for example, the United States of America do not have as strict a data protection regulation as we do in Europe. So, a bank that I used to work for, a financial organization, had some problems. We had 2 European clients, and when the GDPR came in, they didn't want their data stored outside of the EU. So the bank had to build a new, set up a new data center inside the EU to keep the data for these companies. So what's covered by the GDPR then? Personal and sensitive data, just like before. The GDPR now includes this thing here, and this is called pseudonymisation. Very difficult word to say. This means making data less identifiable. Okay, so for example, if I had a large spreadsheet of a lot of my customers and I wanted to get you to do some analysis on that spreadsheet, then you, but let's say I didn't want you to see the names of the customers. I could use some kind of a program or a function to randomize the names. Okay, so if I have a look at pseudonymization, and let's do images, I'll show you an example of this. Here's an example here. So what we've done with the data, here we have some email addresses, here, some information, and we have run it through some kind of function to anonymize it. Okay, and that's included in the GDPR. Okay, so people have a right to have their information hidden. Now, the GDPR provides 8 main rights that individuals have, and these are the right to be informed. So normally, when you go to a website, you might notice that it pops up and says, oh, you realize that we're going to collect cookies about you. Okay, we're going to collect some information about you. Do you consent to that? So that's you being informed. Okay, the right of access. You're allowed to see what data people hold on you. Okay, the right to re-certification. That's a difficult one to say. The right to erasure. The right to restrict processing. The right to data portability. The right to object. And rights relating to automated decision-making profiling. Okay, so in the past, and let's just scroll down. So here is the Data Protection Act 2000 and Data Protection Act 1998 is here. Okay, and here is the Data Protection Act 2018. Okay, being referred to here as the GDPR. So we can see that there are more rights under the 2018 Data Protection Act. Okay, we already have more rights here, especially things like the right to object, and the right to restrict processing. Okay, in the past we didn't have so many rights. So giving your consent to process personal data. The threshold for consent is much higher in the new Data Protection Act, and any request for consent must be very clear. So some of you might remember a long time ago when you used to install some software, what would happen would be you would get a kind of a pop-up box that would appear with the software, and it would say something like, are you sure that you don't not want to have this software installed? It would be difficult, and then it would say something like, if you don't not want to not install the software, then do not untick the box, and you would have to figure it. So the Data Protection Act, the GDPR, got rid of this kind of stuff and allowed us to just have opt-in to things rather than sort of opting out of them in a double negative way. Okay, so we also had new responsibilities for data processors. So in the past, really, all the responsibility was on the data controller and not very much on the data processor. Now, under the new GDPR, the data processor has to abide by laws. And I used to work for a company, and we used to process a lot of data. And what we used to say to get around the Data Protection Act is we used to just pretend that we were only a data processor. Okay, so we used to use that. So the new Data Protection Act stopped that kind of loophole, or closed that loophole, if you imagine. So Article 5 of the GDPR states the main principles of the regulation, and it states that data shall be processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently, only collected for lawful purposes, adequate, relevant, and not excessive. So if it's a shoe company, there's no need for them to keep hold of lots of different data about you. They really only need to know what kind of shoes you like and your shoe size. So it should be not excessive. They don't need lots of data about you. Accurate and up to date. Stored no longer than necessary. So they don't need to keep data on you for years and years. They must, they must get rid of it. And the GDPR brings in this concept of the right to be forgotten. You have a right to be forgotten under the GDPR. So you have a right that, let's say you signed up for an account with a company in 2003, and you've never ever spoken to them since, you've never logged in, you have a right to be forgotten. You have a right. And you also have a right that your data will be kept secure. So here are a comparison between the old Data Protection Act and the new Data Protection Act and some principles. So we have here stored no longer than necessary. I think over here we have not kept longer than necessary, fairly and lawfully processed, only collected for lawful purposes. In the past, it used to just say limited purposes. So this is a little bit better. So now we're talking about what I mentioned before, data stored outside of Europe. So data, especially things like social media data, is stored across many countries. And cloud-based storage means that personal data can be stored on a server outside of Europe. Countries outside of Europe will have different laws to our own when it comes to keeping data secure. And the GDPR states that data can only be transferred to a country or international organization when an adequate level of protection is guaranteed. So if I do a new search, where does the GDPR allow my data to be stored? Okay. Know where your data is. Let's see if we can find where does the GDPR apply to. Guide to GDPR. I'm just going to try and look and see. Maybe I should search for countries that are GDPR. Countries that follow GDPR. Maybe we should go for that one. Is GDPR. Does Australia follow the GDPR? There's an interesting one. Which countries are included? 12 countries with GDPR-like privacy laws. Does the GDPR country list? Let's have a wee look in here and see if we can find some countries that are outside the EU. So we know the UK is outside of the EU. I think all the rest of these are in the EU. Well, what about GDPR outside of the EU? There is also a thing called the EU-US Privacy Shield, which was a framework that they were working on last time I looked into this. Privacy Shield is a US and Swiss US Privacy Shield framework. Okay, so that's maybe something that we could look into in the future. Probably a little bit too detailed for this course. As far as I know, and in the past, there definitely was an issue storing data outside of these countries here. Okay. So yeah. So, but the UK is still compliant. The UK is still up to date with the GDPR, despite having left. Okay, so that's probably enough about the GDPR today. Another act we're going to look at is the Computer Misuse Act 1990. So this one applies to hackers in particular. And the Computer Misuse Act was actually brought into place because Prince Philip was hacked by two people who we used a technique called shoulder surfing. Okay, shoulder surfing is looking over someone's shoulder when they type a password in. If we scroll down here, we'll see that after this unauthorized access was discovered, the authorities struggled to find a law that actually matched what these people had done. And so, because of this, they brought in a law in 1990 called the Computer Misuse Act. And the Computer Misuse Act is if you're doing anything malicious with computers, okay, especially hacking in to computer systems, changing, modifying data, any kind of malicious use would fall under the Computer Misuse Act. And here's some examples. So, denial of service attacks against the police, that was in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. Fraudulent activities in online games, illegal access to confidential emails. So hacking into someone's email would be in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. Bank theft, stalking, hoax calls through online, I guess through Skype-like telephone numbers, and also piracy as well. So those can all be covered under the Computer Misuse Act, and it's designed to protect computer users against willful attacks. And there are 3 types of offences under the Computer Misuse Act: unauthorised access to computer materials, unauthorised access with the intent to commit or facilitate commission of further offences, and unauthorised modification of computer material. So if you were to log into your bank account and give yourself, a few $1 billion, that would be in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. Although if you do know how to do that, then please let me know. So, a person's committing an offence if they make a computer perform any function with intent to secure access to a program or data held in a computer. Okay, and any access to unauthorized access in a computer is in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. Okay, and if you know at the time of making a computer do something that what you're doing is wrong, then you are in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. So the intent of a person to commit an offence doesn't have to be directed at any particular person or program, and a person guilty of an offence under this section will be liable to imprisonment of a term not exceeding 6 months or to a fine under the Computer Misuse Act. And here's some examples of what offences or things that can happen if you're in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. So this is talking about being guilty under Section 1. You could be imprisoned for 6 months, and it could be possible that you could be imprisoned for 5 years in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. So unauthorized modification of material under the Computer Misuse Act, you can also be in breach of it that way. And it says here, requisite intent is the intent to cause a modification of the contents of a computer to either impair the operation of a computer. So if you did something to a computer that made it not work in the way it was meant to, that would be in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. Changing data held in a computer would be in breach of the Computer Misuse Act, and impairing the operation of programs or data are in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. So here's some examples of some offences under the Computer Misuse Act: hacking, unauthorised access, purposefully spreading malicious and damaging software, such as viruses, unauthorised access to modify computers, altering software, changing passwords, interfering with the normal operation of the system to its detriment. So any sort of interference or hacking or use of hacking software like packet sniffers that can be used to break in or discover ways to get into systems are in breach of the Computer Misuse Act 1990. So although intention to do willful damage cannot easily be proved, the Act makes it an offence for a hacker to access and use a system using another person's username. So if you were to break into a computer system using someone else's username, that's in breach of the Computer Misuse Act, including email, chat, other services. The Act also covers unauthorized access to different parts of a computer system. So you may be allowed access to a computer system, but if you go into a specific folder or directory that you're not meant to, you would be in breach of the Computer Misuse Act. So those are the legislation that we're looking at today. So that would be the Data Protection Act and the Computer Misuse Act. And there's a little bit less information about these ones here. These are a little bit smaller. Unfortunately, the Data Protection Act is the big one. The Data Protection Act 2018 and the Computer Misuse Act, I would say, is fairly simple as well. So those are the two we looked at today. And next week, we're going to look at these ones in the square brackets there. So probably time to put together some questions. And to do that, I'm going to head all the way back up here. Okay, so let's have a look through these questions here and see what's going on. I can see Patrick's here. I can see what you've said there. Alistair, sorry I didn't give you a question again. We'll fix that for next week. So what is an example of a case where there has been a prosecution under the Data Protection Act? Couldn't find the answer either. Okay, well, we'll have a look at that in a minute. So, motor industry where an employer accessed consumer records containing, there we go, good. Jack Shepherd, sounds like a character from a film, hacked into a social media account, database and stole the personal information. Ooh. It's moving in real time. And stole the personal information. He has been sentenced to 4 months. Good. Okay. Police officers in Wales broke the Data Protection Act 62 times. 4 people were sacked. Oh, wow. That was a bad one. Making data. Okay, so what is the right to be forgotten? The right of erasure. Absolutely right. Pseudonymisation means you got to watch because in the UK, let me put that one in S there. The process means the processing of personal data in such a way it can no longer attribute it to a specific subject, the additional information separately, organisation. Measures taken to prevent being assigned to an identifiable person. Yes, it's hiding the information. What was the first use? Yes, very good. That's right. First use of the UK, it was a London pharmacy. Oh, wow. 2019, really? Okay. What was a subject access for personal data? That's correct. Who has been fined? British Airways, that's right. They were fined. Payment card, I remember that. You can't find anything, only the names of the companies. So has anyone in Scotland ever been convicted of an offence under the Data Protection Act? So how would I find this? Right, okay. We'll do Scotland Data Protection Act 1998 conviction. Yeah. Maybe we'll just type news. Here we go. You able to see that? Scottish officers convicted of on-duty data offences. 6 police officers in 2013 were convicted under the Data Protection Act 2018. 6 police officers in Scotland. 6. Okay. So let's just change that to, I mean, it's not so important because it doesn't exist anymore. Right. Has anyone in Scotland, in the UK, there are no sentencing guidelines under the Computer Misuse Act, had the detentions, is it not called a suspended sentence, passed on to him for 21 months to DDoS program? Yep. Okay. I think it might be called a suspended sentence in the UK, although I'm not sure. That case was in 2013, but the question was about... No, the question wasn't about 1998. The question was about the Data Protection Act, 1998. Just because the Act was in 1998 doesn't mean all the crimes took place in 1998. Okay, it worked. It was in place from 1998 until 2018. 20 years. Any time in that 20 years. Okay. So, oh, I see. We're talking about the DPA 2018. Sorry, I see where you are. That can be the answer to VS was one there. Okay, so we're looking for this. Okay, so hang on. Let's go back here and let's change that to 2018. Scottish officers, yeah. Exemptions. Scottish GDPR conviction. How do I know if my conviction is spent in Scotland? No, that's not good. Yeah, you're right. Probably is quite difficult to find. Scottish GDPR. Let's try crime. Probably isn't anyone that's been convicted in Scotland yet. It shows you how small and insignificant Scotland is. So, oh wait. Maybe there's no case. I know. But there might have been someone in Scotland who would get sentenced at the High Court in Edinburgh. Edinburgh GDPR crime. Criminal is breaking the GDPR a criminal offence. Privacy. Scottish courts. Your private information. Okay. Scottish Data Protection Act crime 2019. No, you're right. Can't find anything. Recorded crime in Scotland. Probably be searching through this for ages. Okay, we'll need to come back to you on that. Sorry, that's quite a difficult question to give you. Okay, so hopefully this is everyone's got a rough idea of what's happened. I'll need to ask around about this. Actually, you know what I'll do? I'll post that into the staff forum and see if anyone knows about this. Do you know who will maybe know? Maybe George will know, or somebody will know. All right, I'll post that. And see if anybody knows about that. Okay, so yeah, well done everyone. Really good answers there. Actually, I'll make this available on the Moodle, so we've got some answers to some questions there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pause share, jump over to the Moodle, and let's have a look at what we are doing today. Okay, so the practical for this week, let me just stop share, share desktop 2. Right, the practical for this week should be quite interesting. It's actually called a reverse shell. Okay, so we'll leave other legislation until next week, and we're going to look. So don't start downloading this just now because it's quite a big file. All right, it's like, I think it's maybe 700 meg or something like that. Okay, we're going to download a copy of Windows XP, right? And what we're going to do with Windows XP is we're going to set up what's called a reverse shell. So when you SSH into a machine, that is you opening up a shell, that's called, okay? So a reverse shell is when you, as a hacker, open up a shell on a remote machine. Okay, that's why it's called a reverse shell, because you're going in the way rather than heading out the way to a target machine. So to do this, we are going to import the Windows XP OVA, which hopefully should be straightforward for you guys now. We've done it a few times. Then we're going to scan the machine with Nmap. Okay. Then what we're going to do is hopefully identify that we have some open ports on the machine here. Okay. Hopefully from doing the previous lab, we know how to identify open ports using Nmap. All right, now, what we're going to do once we identify the open port, okay, is we're going to use an exploit called the MS0867 Net API exploit. And what we're going to do is we're going to deploy this. We're going to search for it, then we need to enable it in the Metasploit framework. So you would just do use exploit. There we go, use exploit, and put the path to the exploit you want to use. Then you do show options, and you'll have some parameters to fill out. Okay, you'll have like, what's the target IP address, what's the attacker IP address, the R host and the S host, remote host and the local host, R host and L host. So once we've set the R host target IP to be the Windows XP machine at the other end, what we're then going to do, and we've set the local host to be our local machine, we're going to use a payload called reverse TCP. Okay, and this will set up a reverse shell. And then we're just going to run that magic command exploit. That magic command exploit is going to get us a shell in the Windows machine. Okay, so if I open up my terminal here, right, I'm on a Linux machine here. So if I do print working directory, you'll see that I'm in home Michael. Once we've managed to do this exploit, we'll be in a Windows path, something like C:/, you know, users / documents and settings / whatever the Windows path is. Remember, on the Windows path, the / goes back the way, and on a Unix-like path on Linux or on a Mac, the / goes forward. Okay. Now the command print working directory, pwd, gives you your current directory in a Linux machine, but in Windows the command is dir. Okay, which also works on Linux as well. I didn't even realize that worked. Never tried to use it before. Okay, so, well, actually, look, pwd just gives you your current directory, but dir on Linux lists is actually the same as ls. Okay, so dir is your command that you want when you're on Windows. Now, once we're into the Windows machine, we're going to do dir, as I just explained, and you'll see a list of the folders. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to save a document and have a look at the Windows. Okay, and we're going to I've hidden a secret document in there. Okay, and if you use the command type and then the name of the document, you'll see what's inside that secret file. Okay, and I've put a bonus here. You can do this if you like. Work out how to log in as an administrator to the Windows machine using the information that you have in this lab here. Okay, so if you can work out how to log in as an administrator, that would be a good step. So that is lab 5. All right, let me just stop.